Hello and welcome. I am delighted on Thursday, the 5th of November, to introduce you to John Stapleton. Now, John Stapleton is called the Authentic Entrepreneur. He's an angel investor, business mentor, and speaker. And you may know John because, well, the reason I knew John, so that's when I met him a while ago. It was a great pleasure to speak to him. But then he mentioned to me about the new Covent Garden Soup Company. I go, oh, yes, I know exactly what that is. And which he pioneered and grew the fresh soup category in the UK. John then co-founded Glencoe Foods to bring fresh soup concept to the US and founded The Little Dish, which supplies healthy, natural and convenient meals and snacks to children over 1 year old. The question I asked John was that do you think as an entrepreneur, stress is for someone else? And we're going to come on to that in a moment. But what I'd like to do to start off with, John, is to take you back. I'd like to take you back. You've been building businesses in the food industry for over 35 years, just a few years there. I'd just like to know for other people, how did this start?
Great question. And, you know, it's one of those things you kind of evolve into, really, isn't it? So I guess if you take me, I'll take myself way back to the very beginning while I was still at university. And you know, I grew up in Ireland, and back in the early to mid 80s, there wasn't much going on. You know, it was pretty bleak in terms of prospects. So we're kind of looking at what I should do in terms of a career. And food seems to be one of those things that, you know, is not going to go out of fashion. You know, food, you know, people are not going to ever grow tired of it. There will be trends and things will come and go, but people are always going to need to eat and drink. And there are a lot of other things I could have done. I studied industrial microbiology. I could have done biotech. I could have done genetic engineering. In hindsight, they were not bad bets. But food seemed to be pretty certain to me. So I wanted to really understand food. I came to Reading University, came over to the UK, then studied food science there. And that's how I kind of carried from there. I met this guy called Andrew Palmer when he came to Reading to ask some questions about his project. And that's really where the whole new Covent Garden Soup Company idea came from. So really, you know, I was a techie. I went to university and I came straight out of university without any experience and started a food company. So there was no kind of, you know, long process, a long drawn out process or predetermined process. Serendipity. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, Carol. That's how it all happened.
So when then you created the new Covent Garden Food Company. What would you say, because other people who are interested in your entrepreneurship skills, what would you say, John, were your challenges actually while you were doing that?
Yeah, and listen, I think it's important just to explain a little bit about how this whole thing came about, right? Like I say, I was at Reading University and I met this guy, Andrew. It was Andrew's idea. And you know, we got chatting literally, and we went down the pub at lunchtime to talk about this. And we were still kicked out of closing time because we were still there arguing about this whole thing. And the whole idea was really novel. It was like talking about putting fresh soup into a carton. So the whole point about it was nobody did it before. And I guess the only way we could answer all the questions that we had more question marks than answers, was to go and do it ourselves. So the whole premise was about putting soup into a carton, not into a can. I'll take you back to 1987. And this is the big challenge, really, in answer to your question. 1987, all liquid soup was in a can. Yeah. So, you know, it was pretty normal. You'd buy liquid soup in a can, or you'd make it yourself, or you'd buy it in a restaurant. That was the only way to consume liquid soup. The problem with putting it in a can is you ruin all the nutritional composition and you ruin all the flavor profile, you know, of the soup that's in it. We wanted our soup to, funnily enough, if you like, taste of the ingredients we put into the product, rather than the process that was used to make it safe, which is what canning is. So canning takes the ingredients, puts it into, you know, into a can, and then heats it at high temperatures for a relatively long period of time. Makes it safe, gives it 18 months. That's why it's got a long shelf life. It sits on the ambient shelf, and you go and buy it and you keep it at home, and it's very convenient. We wanted to change all that though. We didn't want to provide a product to those people who were happy buying canned soup because they were obviously happy buying it with the quality that they got from that. We were targeting the people who were fed up with canned soup, who wanted something much better, who wanted stuff that you could make at home or buy in a restaurant, but didn't have the time or the skills to make it themselves. So convenience was key. So we wanted the product to be convenient. We wanted it to be fresh. We wanted it to have a short shelf life. And we wanted it to be to taste much more of the ingredients we use to put into the product rather than the process. And that was the big challenge. We had to design the entire process from scratch. We couldn't find anybody to go to say, can you make this soup for us, like you do a lot of the time these days, like an outsourced model? Nobody put fresh soup. Nobody made fresh soup. Certainly nobody put liquid soup in a carton or anything but a can. The answer would be, how big do you want the can to be? So we had to go and do it ourselves. And that was the biggest challenge, dreaming up a process that would actually deliver the flavor of the ingredients into the end product, would actually be safe as well, of course, because we were told it wouldn't work. We were told by so many experts that it just would not work in so many different ways. And so that was the size of the challenge that we faced at the time. Not knowing anything about soup, about the food industry, about business, about anything, because I was straight out of university. So that combined with all of the other things we were trying to do, that was the main challenge back then, 1987, 1988.
Okay, well, that's really interesting. And as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, you're a real entrepreneur at heart. So it's actually in the blood. Were you like this as a child? Or did you see entrepreneurial traits as a child? Were you selling sweets in school for threepence or something or other? I don't know. You hear of those kinds of stories from other entrepreneurs.
You absolutely do. I hear it a lot. And quite frankly, I couldn't spell the word entrepreneur. I had no idea what entrepreneurship was about. I studied, as I say, food science and industrial microbiology. How specific can you get that, and how technical can you get that? I was a techie. I was a scientist. But at the opposite end of the spectrum to what an entrepreneur was meant to be. The scientist is all about first principles and all about testing things to the nth degree and coming up with theories and testing those and taking tiny steps to prove what you think you know. And entrepreneurship is the opposite. It's gut feel, it's creativity, it's having a go, it's having enough insight to think, I know what I'm doing. I don't really, but I'm going to prove it by actually doing it. And the two are so far apart. So I didn't have any grounding or traditional upbringing or experience in entrepreneurship. And when I met Andrew, it was like a whole new world was open to me, because he was the ultimate entrepreneur. I learned a lot from him, except for one thing I'd say. In my defense, I suppose, is I grew up on a farm in the west of Ireland. My dad was a farmer. And you don't often think of entrepreneurs being farmers or farmers being entrepreneurs, but you do get at a very early age, you get a very quick grounding in the practical aspects of life. You're at the whim of the weather, and the weather is very unpredictable in Ireland. Anything can happen, harvests can be ruined, things can come and go very, very quickly. I think you learn that element of being down to earth and responding and reacting as quickly as you can, and taking life as it comes, not taking things personally. And when you're knocked over, stand up, brush yourself off, and carry on again. And I think there's a lot of that resilience that that an entrepreneur needs to dig in and needs to rely upon. So I think, without knowing it, a lot of that came from that early years in Ireland growing up. But the whole world was new to me when I started off with Covent Garden and Andrew and myself. It was a huge experience, a huge adventure. We learned a huge amount going through that whole 10 years of Covent Garden.
So a question that's frequently asked of me is, do you think entrepreneurs are born or made?
I think, there's an element of both, but I think, you probably are to a certain extent born with it, because the element of risk, you have to be very, very comfortable with risk. And some people are, and some people are not. And certainly you can hone your skills and become better at it. And certainly you can learn a lot, and I think entrepreneurs have to learn very quickly. So that would be the element of made, if you like. So you can become better. I think an entrepreneur has to have the attitude, and I certainly have the attitude that I'm learning all of the time. You mentioned earlier, 35 years in the food industry. People think, okay, I've seen everything, I've done everything, I must know everything. Absolutely not. I learn something every day. And one of the reasons I'm still involved with a lot of small businesses and startups, I learn a lot from them. If you think you know everything, you've probably missed the point. So I think that's the whole point of being made. But ultimately, you've got to have the nerves for this. And I do think you just need to kind of not know any better almost. The upbringing I had prepared me for it to a certain extent. But I think it's valuing what you've got, understanding what you don't, trying to bridge the gap and trying to figure out how you can achieve all those things you need to achieve to start and to grow a business. But it comes down to risk. It comes down to being comfortable with risk, because it's a very risky business. Yeah. And you're constantly in the firing line. Entrepreneurs constantly put themselves in the way of adversity because you're trying to do things differently. You're trying to do things in a way that nobody else has done before. That's the challenge. That's where you get a lot of setbacks and knockbacks and people telling you it won't work, like we did at Covent Garden. So you have to have a thick skin, not worry about that, and as I say, stand up each time and move on. And you get lots of no's before you get to a yes. And I think you just have to have the perseverance to get you there. But all the while managing risk, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty around what you're doing. If you were certain about it, you wouldn't be an entrepreneur, or somebody would have done it already. You know, it would be proven. And entrepreneurs, by definition, are doing the unknown, doing the unproven, and trying to prove they're right despite everybody telling them they're wrong.
I think you're absolutely right. And a word that you mentioned a little earlier on, which I'd like to pick up on, because this is a stress and well-being conference summit, is you mentioned the word resilience. And I was just wondering what you see, because I would like you to sort of bring in you had to deal with the fire. That's when you and I first met. You were telling me this story. But I'd like to, there's two things. So the resilience, what is the resilience that you've had to have over that 35 years?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about resilience in many ways, and on the other hand, it's very elusive. Trying to put your finger on resilience. I think it's some of what I just said. Really, it's kind of not caring really too much. Growing a thick skin. You've got to get a lot of no's. You've got to get a lot of setbacks, and that's okay. It's realizing that the world is not ganging up on you when you have a really difficult day, difficult week, difficult month, difficult year. You know, I mean, people are going through right now in terms of where we're all coming from with lockdown 1, lockdown 2, COVID, uncertainty. It's been a very difficult year for many people, if not everybody, in some way, shape, or form. But it's kind of like, you know, it's not your fault. You didn't do something wrong. And most of the time, almost always, you haven't done anything wrong. You know, there's a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of circumstances. And if you're an entrepreneur trying to do things new or differently from any before, you know, there's a lot of trial and error. So the resilience is kind of digging deep, I suppose, but not having to be such a huge effort, because I think this is the problem where pressure then builds up and it converts into stress sometimes. You feel like you have to make a huge effort to actually get anywhere. And I think the trick is to realize that, well, of course you have to put an effort in, but it doesn't have to be over, you know, you don't have to overplay it or overemphasize it. You know, all these things that are not going well for you right now, it's just because you haven't got to the point where they're going right yet, but they will go right. If you're trying to launch a product like new Covent Gardens, for example, in a carton or a little dish, which is something that I did later in life. These are all new ideas and new projects, and they're not going to be instant overnight successes. So you have to have the perseverance to carry through with this. And when the retailer tells you, no, I'm not going to put you on the shelf, you got to go, okay, well, it's not because my idea is bad. It's just he hasn't got it yet. I haven't been able to convince him, or he doesn't see the light, or maybe I can go around this and find some other way of doing it. Let me get to the consumer, try to sell to them. Then I go back to my retailer and say, look, it is working. So there are always ways around this. It might take longer and it might be frustrating, but you're going to have to stick with it. And if you're convinced that your idea in an FMCG world anyway, or a food and drink world, is rooted in really good consumer insight. So if you really know your target audience, you really know your consumer, then that's, you know, nobody else can say you're wrong. So persevere with it. And then the resilience kicks in, because, you know, if you're convinced you're going to come out at the end of the day, God knows it might take longer, and you haven't got any money left, and all these things are happening to you. But by being resilient is just having confidence in that, you know, you have an idea that nobody has thought about yet, and you just need a little bit more time or a little bit more luck. And you win, you know, it will work in the end. And that was true of New Covent Garden, it was true of Little Dish, it's true of so many successful entrepreneurial ideas.
So if we were to look at the title that you gave me today, which was Stresses for Someone Else, is it because entrepreneurs don't admit when they're experiencing stress? Because everybody does experience stress, because let's be quite honest, is that stress is excessive pressure, and we can all experience excessive pressure. Things go wrong. So we'll go from pressure, which is good for you, gets you up in the morning, into stress, which is not good for you, and you're out of control. So there's your difference between the two. So does an entrepreneur say, stress isn't for me, yes, it's for somebody else, and it doesn't exist? What is the mindset, John, of that entrepreneur as far as stress is concerned?
That's such a great question, and I'll come back to the whole stress versus pressure thing in a minute, because I think that was a revelation to me, and that helped me figure things out. But it's kind of like, to be an entrepreneur, you know, we talked about resilience, and you talked about you know, managing risk. I think the other element of it is you have to have a bit of an ego as an entrepreneur, frankly. You know, it's kind of like, who gives you the right to think that you're right and everybody else who's telling you is wrong? Number one. And who said that it was okay for you to be knocked back 6, 7, 8, 9 times only to hold out and come through the 10th time? You need a bit of arrogance. You need a bit of ego to actually stand firm in the face of being told you're wrong so often and being kicked back so often. And okay, when I say ego, you just need to believe you're right. Because you know you're right, because you've got insight into the consumer in my world, or whatever the reason is, whatever the justification you can use. But you do need to have that ego, which, despite all the adversity, you keep standing firm and you keep trying to push through what you believe is right. And that's fantastic, because without that, you won't achieve very much in the entrepreneurial world. The problem is that ego can sometimes turn into it's a great asset, but it can certainly turn into a liability if you don't recognize your own weaknesses. And coming back to the point I was making, when I met you for the first time, actually, it was about a year ago, and I was talking about stress can be a good thing, it can be a positive thing, and you stopped me in the track and you said, no, John, pressure can be a good thing. You can use pressure to motivate yourself and move forward. But when it becomes stress, then stress is a bad thing, because that gets in the way of you reaching your potential. And when I thought about that, I thought that's a great way of putting it, because what is stress? And if you look at stress as stuff it takes away from your potential or gets in the way of you reaching your potential, then you want to avoid it, don't you? People say, oh, I had a very stressful day, and it's kind of a throwaway line. You haven't really. You probably had a very pressurized day, and you may have handled it well, or maybe you haven't. And I think entrepreneurs, because they've got this ego, necessarily to get up in the morning and do things and crash through walls and uproot trees and succeed despite the odds, they tend to have, I'm speaking, when I say they, by the way, I'm speaking from myself, from bitter experience also. But we tend to have a blind spot on recognizing this really interesting interface between pressure and stress, because it's a bit of a nuance if you don't think about it. I never thought about it until only last year, till you mentioned it, but it explains things quite well. So if we think that we're good at handling pressure, and pressure is our life, and without pressure, without resistance going on, then there's not much to be achieved. So we almost define ourselves by pressure, and we define ourselves by overcoming pressure. And it's very easy then to kind of think, okay, well, I'll just define myself for overcoming stress, when we don't recognize when one has become the other. And I think that is the key point, recognizing the difference between pressure and stress, because all these obstacles are things that, from an entrepreneurial point of view, are just put in our way to be solved. And we can easily think that stress is something, oh, well, let's just solve that as well by, I don't know, ignoring it, cracking on, doing whatever it is, without recognizing it, stepping back and dealing with it.
I think that's absolutely right, and I'm really pleased that you that you remembered that conversation. It's like, sometimes you think you say something to somebody, it doesn't actually go in. So it's really not. It's really good to hear that, because so many people do get that one wrong. They think stress is great, and it's really not. So what you're saying is, what is great, exactly what you said, is pressure. It's excessive pressure is when it becomes stress. So also, you talked to me about, I really just want to highlight that. Talk to me about the fire that happened, because that was a huge challenge for you at that time. We talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, and we were sort of discussing that. So talk to me a little bit so that the listeners, the viewers, can actually hear that story from you, because it's very, very evocative.
Yeah, it was just one of those small things which became a big thing, and I think this is so typical of pressure versus stress as well. It's like, we were. Okay, so we were a couple of years into soup, yeah. So we had devised the new process, right? So so we had this new product that was on the shelves, 87, 88, small little factory in Reading. Then we built our kind of proper factory in London in the late 80s, and then we were using it, filling it up all through the 90s. And around about 90, I can never remember the dates, but it's probably 93, 94. We realized we needed a second factory, because we were getting close to capacity on the old one, and we didn't really need it today, but we needed it next year, and it takes a while to build a factory. So long story short, we were getting ready with our second factory, which was in Peterborough, a little bit further away. And I lived in London, and everything was in London at the time. In fact, the first factory was in London, and so it was a very, I was just about to say it was a very stressful year. It was a very pressurized year, because we were, well, I say we, I was particularly responsible for the whole operations of the business. So we were cranking up volume, if you like, in the existing factory, getting efficient, bringing out new products, going full steam ahead. We had a tiger by the tail, really, with New Covent Garden. It was hugely successful. We were hoping it would be. We had no idea if it would. Certainly no idea that it would be this successful. And we were trying to keep up with volume. trying to keep up with demand, going from one thing to the next and the next and the next. So we're, you know, it was great. It was, like I said before, it was an adventure. It was a white knuckle ride. It was hugely motivating. Nothing could have, you know, dragged me away from it. At the same time, I was building this second factory with all the lessons we had learned from the first factory. So we're incorporating that into the design and getting all the stuff you need to do. Won't go into the detail, but it was almost 2 jobs in one, right? But again, it was hugely motivating. And this was great, and this is building for the future. And you know, don't stop me now. And then we had a fire at Factory 1, which was a real bummer because it kind of, you know, cut all volume or cut all output from Factory 1. But the silver lining was we were sort of almost ready with Factory 2, but weren't really. So we pulled out all the stops to get ready. We were a good 6, 8, 10 weeks away, and we brought it right down to 2 weeks. So we only had 2 weeks where there was no soup on the shelves. Which was pretty phenomenal considering the problem we were facing. So having been working all day, all night anyway on the 2 day jobs, to working even more than that, if that's possible, to getting this other factory ready and transferring people up because we had no staff, and the factory was different, so they didn't really know. Oh, it was a crazy time. So but did it, you know, and brought that initial 10 weeks we thought we're going to need to bridge that to 2. So it was great. It was fantastic. It was, yeah, well done. That was a success if ever there was one. And cracked on through that and never felt a thing. 3 months later, I'm talking about 3 months after the second factory had been gotten up, and by then the old factory was running again anyway, because we had solved the problem with the fire. I began to feel weird, and I've forgotten what age it was. It was in my late 20s. It was like, you know, you don't feel weird. This is, you know, stress is for other people, like I said. And nobody could have talked to me back then about the difference between pressure and stress. I would have gone, not interested, doesn't bother me, you know, all that sort of thing. Ego, there's an ego there, don't get me wrong, but ego is normally used for positive purposes in terms of getting things done. This began to get in my way. This is a good example of what I was saying earlier about getting in my way. I began to feel palpitations. You know, I remember vividly in the shower getting palpitations, and I haven't even had a coffee this morning yet. How could that be? And it would get worse, and then it would go away. And somebody said you should go and see the doctor. I go, yeah, no, what? Doctors for people who are sick, you know? And he goes, yeah, maybe you should go and see the doctor. And I go, I'm not sick. I'm just, you know, let me cut out the coffee. And I did, and I'm sure it did me good, but it didn't stop the palpitations. So I said, I kind of dragged myself along to the doctor to say, you know, I felt a bit sheepish about kind of, you know, I'm not sure I should be here, but I'm a bit feeling weird, and I'm only, you know, 28 or something. I shouldn't be feeling weird, should I? And he did ask me the question, you have to forgive him. Any stress in your life? And I go, no, not really. You know, everything's been pretty cool since we had that problem back a couple of months ago. That's all over. I go, so when was that? And I explained the whole story. And he actually clearly was a doctor who knew about stress and pressure, and he wasn't going to fob it off as something that I had done, or that I had, the attitude I had. And he said, oh yeah, no, that can happen. I said, well, what can happen? I don't even understand what you're saying. You know, it's post-traumatic or whatever, you know, there's a whole bunch of, you know, terms he uses. It's quite normal. You can crack on through things. You're on adrenaline, you're working yourself to the bone, and then you have even more pressure. You find a way to get through, and it's only afterwards that it begins to kind of crash in on your body. And I said, really? I've never heard of this. And so what do I do? You know, give me a solution. He said, well, you just need to calm down and take it easy for a bit, which was the worst thing you could have said to me. I said, no, I've got what other things I want to do now, and you know, we're being through that, and the stuff that I didn't get around to doing then I want to do now. I said, well, you know, just take it from me. If you just cut back a little bit and just maybe take a holiday and come back and just clear your head of all this, and don't be running around too crazy trying to do 2 factories, and find somebody to delegate to, and that was it. First of all, I had to figure it out, realize it. Secondly, I had to admit it. And thirdly, I had to realize it wasn't an easy answer. It wasn't a pill I could take to put it right and get back on the horse. And all that took a while. It took a hell of a while for me to figure out. And of course, once I felt better, I'd forgotten about it again until another time where pressure bubbled into stress many years later. And I went, I should be smarter about this because I've been here before. And so I guess I was sick, like not hugely, but who would have known if I had cracked on and not taken the time out to deal with it. And I think many people mistake these symptoms for just another kind of element of what they have to deal with, because they've dealt with everything so far in their lives, and everything's worked out. And I think that's maybe the weak link or the blind spot in an entrepreneur's life, is they don't recognize when things are happening to themselves that they should just take some time out and fix. So that's my little anecdote. And, you know, I hope that makes sense to people. Certainly, it's certainly in hindsight made a lot of sense to me.
Yes, and also it was the story that you told me, and it was highly evocative, and it is very meaningful. It really is very meaningful, because what you didn't do at the time was well, you did because you went to the doctor, and you actually, fortunately, you did do something about it. But what so many people do is they have a situation like that. They think it's not going to happen to me. I'm going to beat this. They have no idea what it is, but you know, I'm going to get through this. Oh, I'll just carry on. And the mindset is just, you know, mindset and attitude, just get on with it. But of course, the body doesn't necessarily, the body needs time to heal, which is what you did in the end. So fortunately, you were able to deal with it, but it nevertheless, the anecdote has become something for you, which has been really important for the rest of your life. And that's why I want you to tell that anecdote to people who are watching this, because it's very real. Because many people think, you know, as you said to me, entrepreneurs, you said stress is for somebody else. Well, that was the title. Well, of course it's not, because people are people. But I think entrepreneurs have a very strong mindset, dedication, commitment. I'm going to do everything I can. I'm going to crack everything I can. I'll take whatever risk is necessary, but don't appreciate necessarily that health and well-being are the key parts to that underneath it. So what would you say, as we bring this really, really interesting, I could talk to you for hours, but we've got half an hour. What would you say are the key things for you then, John, in terms of looking after your own health and well-being?
Well, yes, and I figured some of these things out subsequent to even that story. I mean, I've been around the block for quite a while, but just on that point, it's very important, I think, to recognize that when stress kicks in and you don't feel well, it's not your body being weak. It's not your body letting you down. It's the opposite. Your body's quite a smart thing. It's your body giving you a signal. It's your body shouting out, going, "Hang on, you're on the wrong path here, and it's not quite terminal stations yet. But if you don't do something about it, it might be." And I think we're very poor, or very bad entrepreneurs, people maybe generally, business people, very bad at recognizing those signals from our body, our minds, or whatever it is just screaming out saying, change, stop doing this, do something else. So I think that's a smart thing if you can figure that out. And that is back to, you know, listen, I'm for the food industry, I should know this anyway. And of course, you know, we're probably the worst, but, you know, and it's going to sound so boring, but, you know, get enough sleep and drink enough water and do everything in moderation and have a sensible, balanced lifestyle. I mean, you know, there's no rocket science about this. I think we all want to find new ways of taking shortcuts and not having to take exercise and slimming and whatever it is. It's like, no, it's like, just do stuff in moderation. Of course, you can go crazy every so often. You know, that's part of moderation, so long as this is every so often. But I think, you know, people say, oh, I can live on. I remember at the time, Margaret Thatcher said, I could live on 4 hours sleep a night. And everybody goes, wow, that's such an achievement. Well, that's a huge outlier. I mean, you know, that's inhuman. Maybe you need more than that. But well, sorry, maybe you can't get by on that, but you certainly need more than that. So I think it's just packing away those hours of sleep and drinking enough water, not so much coffee and not so much alcohol, but having a balanced diet. I think health and wellness is what people are much more aware of it these days than certainly back in the 80s and the 90s. And you know, habits weren't as finely tuned as they are now. But I think also it's kind of like looking out for those stress triggers in life. So where are the symptoms, you know, that you can't explain? So, you know, I'm relatively fit, I eat reasonably well, and still I'm not feeling well. So why is that? So there's probably something going on there that you don't know about or you haven't recognized. And I think it's just listening to your body, you know. So on top of all those things I mentioned, it's just listening to your body. And it's so much easier said than done, because you're running at 120 miles an hour and you haven't got time for any of that really. But of course, that's failing. So I think take time out to just figure out why you're not feeling as well as you should do, given everything that's going on, and then try and put a finger on it, and then try and seek help. You know, I was dragging myself. I felt stupid going to the doctor. I thought, like, you know, what am I sitting in the doctor's waiting room for? This is silly. I almost went home. Don't. Just reach out and ask people for advice and professionals or other people who are in similar stressful situations or busy lives as you are. Ask them. Do they ever feel like this? You know, all that stuff helps, you know.
If there are any budding entrepreneurs watching this video, you are a successful entrepreneur of 35 years. What one piece of advice would you give to them?
Did you mean in a health and wellness context, or
I don't mind. I don't mind. A bit of advice in terms of, yes, in terms of looking after yourself and being, you know, being true to yourself. And yes, just a piece of advice for somebody who may be 25 years old thinking, I really want to be that entrepreneur. Could John Stapleton help me? And so what kind of advice would he give to me?
I mean, you know, in terms of looking after yourself, you know, mind and body. I touched on it earlier that we're always learning. I think don't close yourself off to learning. It's been a huge. I mentioned it earlier. You know, white knuckle ride. Maybe it's a little bit less so now, but it's been a huge adventure. And part of that adventure is learning new stuff all the time. Yes, you see the same things happening over and certain issues repeated and cycles occurring, but they're always different in lots of ways. Products different, the entrepreneur is different, the consumer is different, we're different. You know, talk about different. We're going through a huge amount of difference if it's just being concertinaed or concentrated into just the last few months. So changes in consumer behavior in terms of the pandemic has been enormous, accelerated globally across industries. So what I would say is, you know, look after yourself. Listen to what's happening in your body. Listen to what's happening in your mind. Have a balanced approach to life. From an entrepreneurial point of view, over on top, the cherry on top is we're going through a huge amount of uncertainty right now, but uncertainty is your friend. Uncertainty is the friend of the entrepreneur, because in uncertainty, the entrepreneur thrives. A successful entrepreneur basically turns uncertainty into competitive advantage. And the status quo serves the establishment, serves the corporate, serves the guy who's been around for a long time. They move very slowly, but very effectively and deal with the status quo. We're the guys who are challengers and disruptors. And there's no time like now to be a challenger and disruptor, because there's so much uncertainty and there's so much opportunity and there's so much things changing and so many things in flux. And consumers, in terms of my world, like FMCG, are changing their behaviors all the time. First of all, they were forced to because lockdown, and now they got used to it a little bit, and they quite like that stuff that they never did before, and they're doing more of it. Like buying online is a classic example. Yeah. There's a huge amount of opportunity out there, and the opportunity is there for the right entrepreneur to grasp it. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you very much indeed. John Stapleton, the authentic entrepreneur, angel investor, business mentor, and speaker. Thank you so much for your time. On behalf of ISMA, the International Stress Management Association, we value you, we appreciate you, and thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carol. Delighted to be along. Thanks for the opportunity.